Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Duncan Dukin Williams, the director of the USC Ito Center, the Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. And we are here in Los Angeles. So for us, it's afternoon, but good evening for those of you who are out on the East Coast. And I know a few people are joining us from Japan, which I believe is early morning. So our event today, Sangha in Pandemic Times, has as its backdrop the initial lockdown back last year here in California, when in that color-coded tier system we have in California, we were in the purple tier, the most restrictive tier, when our houses of worship, our Buddhist temples, and many, many Sangha communities were in accordance with the guidance from the state and county, forced to close down the temples and practice groups, ceremonies, funerals, Dharma teachings. Many things were closed down and disrupted. Today, in February of 2021, in California, we're in one less restrictive tier, colored tier, but still today, most of our temples are closed down. And in that midst of our institutions, Buddhist institutions, Sanghas, trying to adapt to this current situation, we've seen many kinds of innovations and different ways that people have dealt not only with continuing on the running of Buddhist organizations, but on a more individual kind of level, people hoping to find in the Buddhist teaching something to help in this kind of time when people are less able to gather, feel more isolated. So today's conversation will be one that, of course, not only focuses on California here, Los Angeles, but in fact, we hope to have a trans-Pacific conversation around what has the shape of the Sangha become in this time of the pandemic. We have three wonderful speakers with us today. I think they will give us some insights about different groups, how people have found forms or glimpses of liberation at a time of constraint, how people have enacted, skillful adaptations that whenever in the history of Buddhism there is adversity, Buddhist communities have found different ways to respond. And so we hope to hear from examples in Japan, in North America, across the Pacific. And so we invite all of you to, along the way, make comments in the chat, ask questions either in the chat or in the Q&A function. And what we'll do is have three formal presentations, followed by, with myself trying to moderate some discussion and answer some of your questions to the speakers, an event that will last for 90 minutes. And so I'm going to be just introducing each speaker as they come on. The first speaker is a specialist of Japanese Buddhism. He's an associate professor at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University, Leva McLaughlin. He's both the co-author of Hamamoto, Politics and Religions in Japan, 2014, and author of the monograph Sokogakai's Human Revolution, The Rise of a Mimetic Nation in Modern Japan, from the University of Hawaii Press, 2019. He's written on this topic articles and reports about what is going on in the midst of 2020 and to the present moment, about what is going on in Japan under COVID. And he will be presenting to us at a presentation titled Zooming Clergy Virtual Laity, Japanese Buddhist innovation in the Corona scene. And so let me hand things over to Professor McLaughlin.
Duncan, thank you so much. I really appreciate you putting this together. It's wonderful to be here with other fabulous speakers. Thank you everyone also for making time to join in. I'm just going to dive in. So I've given this a somewhat awkward title with a somewhat tortured neologism, Zooming Clergy, Virtual Laity, Japanese Buddhist innovations in the Corona scene. I'm thinking in terms, of course, the Corona scene, riffing on the idea of the Anthropocene, where there may be a natural trigger or originary event, but an entirely human-made catastrophe that follows. It's also a scene, or rather a series of scenes for us to contemplate and to consider in perhaps in Buddhist terms. Let me start with this scene. So here is an image of a priest. And this very importantly is a priest who is commemorating the catastrophe that is most recent before the pandemic, and that is the 3/11 disasters. Here is the Shingon sect priest Mochizuki Shue, on the 1-year anniversary of the March 11th, 2011 disasters that unleashed great suffering in Northeast Japan. It's very significant for us that Reverend Mochizuki died of COVID-19 on January the 18th of 2021. He became something of a fixture over the last decade. He would stand in at the Ginza crossing in Tokyo, in amongst some of the most glitzy, high-end department stores, throngs of well-heeled tourists passing him by, well-heeled business people, and there he had his traditional hat and begging bowl, reminding people, of course, of the memory of the suffering. And I think it's significant that he himself, this singular person, binds together these two calamities of our time. And also represents the ways that Buddhism functions as a repository of memory, and also a repository of know-how, of response in many ways, materially and otherwise, to unfolding disasters in Japan. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about Buddhist responses in different ways to the pandemic, that it was now really, certainly in a Japanese context, we're hitting the 1-year anniversary. So let me first, before I dive into the specifics of the Buddhist aspects, lay out some context about what has happened, what has transpired in Japan in terms of the coronavirus pandemic. So I should also mention that throughout this, I'm going to be providing a bunch of links. I'm happy, by the way, Duncan, Shannon, people at the Ito Center, I'm going to make this presentation available. You can host it or share it. I can also email it to you. It's full of links with English language resources for those of you who want to follow up for teaching purposes or otherwise on this topic. Very happy to share this with you. So what we have here are a series of helpful graphs that are from data collated by the Ministry of Health in Japan, helpfully put together by Toyo Keizai Online. And this is from a few days ago, and it indicates essentially the cresting of what has been the third wave of infections in Japan, still rising deaths. It's gone up actually in the last day or so once again. So, I mean, in an international framework, and it's certainly viewed from the United States, which is of course a glaring global outlier, Japan looks like a COVID success story of sorts, given that the numbers are, comparatively speaking, quite low. The number of deaths is crest of 6,000 in a population of just under 127 million. This seems like a low number. Viewed from a Japanese perspective, though, most people would not agree that the COVID response in Japan has been entirely successful. And there's considerable friction between imperatives on the part of politicians, particularly at the national level, and also at the Tokyo metropolitan level, and popular opinion. And this is really crystallized recently around the continuing mandate to host the but we're going to be the 2020, are now going to be the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. And this has really attracted the lion's share of attention recently. And last few days, largely because of the incredibly stupid comments on the part of former Prime Minister Mori Yoshiro, making really misogynist comments about meetings and things like that. And also pushed forward also by the governor of Tokyo, Koike Yuriko, who are insisting that the world will come to Tokyo despite this ongoing threat. There was a recent public opinion poll where 11% of respondents thought it was a good idea to keep holding the games. So there's considerable tension in Japan. I raise this issue because it is the backdrop, it's the framework within which Buddhist responses are unfolding. So it is significant, and there is great uncertainty about how things are going to proceed, how vaccine rollout will go, and all these things. They have a profound impact on how clergy and laity are responding. So let me get into that. Think about some specifically Buddhist dimensions of life in Japan under COVID. I'm going to start by looking at some reflections by clergy, drawing on wisdom and compassion on the teachings to think about how COVID has actually provided opportunities to reflect on Japan's legacies of systemic bigotry and ways to move beyond it. There's some profound insights that will, of course, speak beyond Japanese specifics and be relevant to, well, very certainly an American audience. I'm going to look also at some pragmatic aspects, some aspects that relate to the finances of temples, the ritual calendar, how rituals are carried out, and all kinds of innovations that are underway now, and opportunities too for ways that Buddhism is now making its way into new quarters or being revived in quarters where it had been previously not quite as prominent. I'm going to consider one lay activist adaptation. In this case, I'm going to look at Soka Gakkai, which is the largest so-called new religion in terms of Buddhist lay activism in Japan. It provides us a very informative window into how lay activism has been playing out. And then finally, look at a heartening example of social welfare initiatives that are promising directions toward ecumenical understanding and putting to work some of those insights that I mentioned at the beginning here about opportunities to think about the ugly histories that Japan has and ways to evolve beyond them. The one example I have here is one of many, many that I could have chosen of the necessary adaptations on the part of clergy and temple-based Buddhists of other sorts. So in this case, we have there's a network of temples in Japan that has started basically a business of what's called otera stay, or temple stay, which has invited people to stay overnight in temples, learn about rituals, also receive some introductory instruction in some traditional arts. Obviously, no one can stay overnight during this period of what's called jishuku, or self-restraint, which is, it's important to point out that for the most part, the Japanese government has not actually required too many official strictures, but it's actually called on people to self-restrain in order to forestall infection. And everyone in Japan has this word jishuku now in their regular vocabulary. And so the otera stay moved into otera stay online. And so this is one example indicative of the kinds of moves. And I'm going to talk about how successful or not successful different aspects of this have been. Let me start with one really striking interaction that I've had the privilege of undertaking over the last year. Since the start of COVID, I've been corresponding with a Shingon priest, another Shingon priest. And she's a woman priest who's a head priest of a temple in Wakayama Prefecture. It's close to the sect headquarters on Koya-san, or Mount Koya. And she is fond of sending these magisterial essays to me, these massive, massive missives that are full of insights, wide-ranging observations, and it always takes me an enormous amount of time to read them and digest them. And I can never quite do justice to everything she has to tell me. But in this, so I'm going to choose one example, which I think is really, really profound. And so just one kernel that was within a much larger recent email that she sent me just a few weeks ago, actually. So what Reverend Asahikawa, and it's a pseudonym that I'm using in this case, noted to was that she said that she's been listening to the radio, watching TV, and hearing repeatedly this a version of a phrase that in reflection on the coronavirus. And the phrase has always gone along the lines of, in 2019, the first coronavirus infection in Japan was confirmed in a Yokohama man with Chinese citizenship. And it kept emphasizing the Chinese origins and the Chinese citizenship of this person in Japan. And she noted that, genomic analysis actually, by the point that this rhetoric started to become common, that the virus itself was largely imported from European mutations, and that's largely what you find in Japan now. But that version of fear is not actually what seems to be in place. And instead, what we see here is a recursive instance or a return to an anti-Asian fear. And she perceptively notes that this is a repeat of the kinds of reactions that have become quite standard in modern Japan, of a use of rhetoric and then a triggering violence against foreigners, for people of non-Japanese origin living in Japan. And she brought in particular the example of the anti-Korean massacre, the attack on Korean residents following the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, which destroyed Tokyo and killed many people. And then subsequently, many thousands of Koreans were killed or maimed and their properties were destroyed. So in this reflection, Reverend Asahikawa urges us to think about the parable of the poison arrow that comes from the Pali Canon. And this is a parable that I've taught my own students every single time I've taught Buddhism. And of course, will be familiar to almost everyone who knows about Buddhism. But just to remind you, or to tell you about it in case it's the first time, in response to one of the unanswerable questions about what can we know about origins, the Buddha raises the example of a man being struck by a poisoned arrow, and instead of heeding the advice to have this poisoned arrow removed by surgeons, instead starts demanding the people around him for information about the social status of the archer. Was this person a farmer, a merchant, a kinsman, a worker? What was and for our purposes, very intriguingly, in this original parable, the person who was hit by the arrow also asks, what was the complexion of the archer? Was he ruddy? What was the color of his skin? And I think that there's an eerie resonance between that original parable and the incipient racism, the systemic racism that Reverend Asahikawa pointed to. And so what she says is that when there is a calamity, when there is a virus of a pandemic, when there is a disaster, there's this instinct to start blaming others for the misfortune that has befallen us, and instead we must turn to understanding karmic causality. We must look to ourselves. We must look to ways to move beyond this endless cycle of hate. To think for a few minutes about how these Buddhists who are full of these insights have been forced to operate under this year of pandemic conditions. There have been, from almost everybody, significant changes to what's known as the Nenchu Gyoji, or the yearly cycle of rituals and events. at temples, most certainly when it comes to funerals and memorials. This is something that I picked up on early when I was doing some intensive correspondence earlier in the year of the pandemic, and this seems to have been routinized in over recent months. It should be pointed out that the shutdown in Japan hasn't been even. There have been moments of reprieve, especially toward the end of the summer, but then now, once again in January, there's been an emergency measures top down from the prime minister. And so once again, Japan is largely shutting down in-person meetings. But overall, following the dictates of self-restraint, this had a big impact, especially on funerals and memorial services as well. And there are these wrenching accounts of, especially early in the pandemic, of priests being forced to come up with all kinds of on-the-fly ways to use their mobile phones to stream the services to the bereaved. In most cases, only one relative, in many cases, would be allowed to attend the body of the deceased. And this is, of course, a tradition where people are expected to care for their own dead, at least ritually or ceremonially. There's also quite a lot of contrast in terms of whether the temples are in the countryside or in the urban areas, whether they are large or small, if they were depending on sources of donations beyond what is typical for most Buddhist temples, which is to say funerals and memorials. One stat, and this is actually an area where the Buddhist universities in Japan are gathering a lot of data, which I think it's coming out and it's being published in various reports from Komazawa University and others. But essentially, what I'm told by priests is that if you have a family of three, a couple with one kid in the temple, and if you can hold 10 funerals in a month, you can make ends meet. Anything beyond that, anything less than that is really starting to be restricted. And so this is becoming a very trying time financially for many temples. And in fact, there's considerable worries in the Buddhist community about the survival of temples that were maybe already on the edge before the pandemic. And so but they are, of course, committed by virtue of social pressures, but also internalized pressures to maintain what is known in Japan as the 3 C's, or the sanmitsu, the 3 closes is actually a better translation. So they have to avoid close spaces, close quarters, and close contact. So you have to think in terms of what does it mean to carry out Buddhist rituals? Well, all 3 of those things are common. And so it's become extremely difficult to maintain any kind of ordinary activity. And so the difference between, for example, Dharma talks, lectures, testimonials, instruction, and rituals are becoming quite distinct. And this is largely actually thanks to this kind of technology. Some things work well, other things don't work well. It's not bad for like what we're doing right now, receiving lectures, listening to information, sharing ideas through ordinary conversational modes. It's very poor when it comes to any kind of prayer, chant, or any sort of liturgical activity, especially if multiple people want to take part. If you think about what it might mean to take part in any kind of ceremony, what a full-bodied experience this is, what a sensorial, overwhelming sometimes sensorial impact it has on you. And how it resonates through your body and through your consciousness, how that is, and the word that comes to my mind is exsanguinated, how this is drained of its blood, drained of its vitality when it's reduced to a Zoom call. And so this came across in a conversation that I had via messaging with another priest whom I'm going to call Reverend Omori from the Jodo Shinsho, the True Pure Land sect. Reverend Omori is somewhat elevated in terms of that he's quite well known. He's well sought. He lectures regularly across Japan. Is a sought after contributor to publications in Buddhist circles, but also in the vernacular press. So he's a little bit of an outlier, but nonetheless, I think he gives us some indications to some of the shifts that are underway. He said there was an increase, series of requests, especially from the summer onwards, when I think that the conventions for giving online instruction were set by about August of last year. He started doing a lot of that. He said actually, and compared to traveling up and down the country, it was quite easy to do the online version. But he said there was a decreased interest in online rituals. And I think that's significant. And it also speaks to what is lost when we can't meet in person, we can't practice in person. Intriguingly, also, he talked about there was a rise in interest from quarters outside of what you might call conventional Buddhist frameworks, and especially in the business world. And so there is this keen interest, a rising interest, notably in corporations. This is not new. Buddhist priests for decades have been really integrated into the business world, but it's possible that there might be renewed interest, partly because the businesses themselves are seeing ways to keep their employees focused, connected, somehow to revive them, spiritually. But also on the part of the priests themselves who are enterprising, who are seeking new fields to plant karmic seeds. And I think that there's a great potential there on the part of those who have the know-how, who have the technical ability and the outgoing nature that will allow them to do this. So what appears to be unfolding right now is something of a split, a generational gap that is opening up between priests like Reverend Omori, who are capable of making advances into these new territories, and those who are really tied to their local level communities, who are less reliant on the technology. And it's likely that that divide will persist after the pandemic. It seems unlikely that that will go away. And so I think we're really seeing a post-COVID-19 Buddhism taking shape to some degree on the temple Buddhist level. Let's think about what you might call a non-temple Buddhist example. And this is the controversial organization Soka Gakkai. Controversial for reasons that many people on this call will probably know, which is that it's an organization that's renowned for its proselytizing, its hardcore conversion efforts, its involvement with electoral politics in Japan, reverence for its honorary president, Ikeda Daisaku, who marked his 93rd birthday on January 2nd of this year. And it's also labeled a new religion, which layers on a great deal of stigma for Soka Gakkai. And this has meant a few things for the organization that set it apart from the experiences of what you might call traditional Buddhism in Japan. So for example, when the pandemic was first unfolding early in 2020, Soka Gakkai, along with, I have to also point out, with other groups that bear this label, New Religion, was one of the first organizations, religious groups, to just shut down completely. Shut down all in-person meetings across the board. And this is significant because there are millions of members of Soka Gakkai. Highly coordinated, of course, incredibly sophisticated hierarchical structure that allows it to issue orders like that and ensure a pretty much complete instantaneous compliance with the rules, which is different, of course, from the way that temples operate as well. And so there has been some intermittent and cautious return to some in-person gatherings over this past year at Soka Gakkai culture centers and other facilities, but largely there's been a move online. And then interestingly for us, this is where actually elderly people who are not part of that digital native generation have become quite used to using Zoom and other technologies. So some of the members of the Married Women's Division, the Fujimbu, which is well known to be the most active and energetic of the subdivisions within Soka Gakkai, are telling me that even their members who'd never owned a mobile phone before are now happily meeting on Zoom. And there has been a way to essentially create hybrid versions of the Zarankai, or the monthly study meetings and other meetings, to include people who were at all different technological levels. Some people are only listening through their conventional phones in some cases as well. And like the insights from Reverend Omori, this is a place where practice is really revealed to be dependent upon what's technologically possible. So again, this is a place where this kind of interaction is fine, but when it comes to actually practicing the chant, it falls apart. The musicality of that experience is lost on Zoom because you have to line up together. And when you line up together, you literally resonate with one another. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, chanting the 7 sacred syllables of the title of the Lotus Sutra, is this powerful experience, transformative experience for adherents. And now that's essentially lost. There are other aspects that are also lost. And this is part of the, not just the liturgical practices, but the training mechanisms that comprise a great deal of what it means to live a Soka Gakkai life. This is particularly notable in the youth divisions. And so we've lost a year for these members. And so there are these training mechanisms that are in place for the young men's division, the young women's division, which are intensive, they're highly interactive, they rely upon lengthy periods of time spent with one another, learning texts, learning things like how to protect and carry out the activities of the facilities, all kinds of other stuff that has now been reduced to kind of keeping things rolling via online means. So I think that there's going to be, again, a generational split. Those who lived through the COVID experience and those who didn't, depending on how long it keeps going, we'll see how much of an impact this ends up having on an organization that really relies on in-person interactions. One place where we're seeing that, the effects of that right away, though, are in politics. And I just want to raise this briefly because I think it has an impact on Japan as a whole, too. There are measurable costs to Soka Gakkai's inability to muster its resources to gather votes. Soka Gakkai's affiliated political party, it's called Komeito, or the Clean Government Party, it's sometimes translated, comprises the junior partner in the national level coalition. It punches above its weight in terms of its ability to get out the vote. And we see it play out not just at the national level, but in regional levels as well. And there's one example recently where the inability of Soka Gakkai to gather in person clearly had an effect on an electoral outcome. And that was the November 1st, 2020 referendum in Osaka. Basically, this is somewhat in the weeds when it comes to describing Japanese politics, but there was an attempt on the part of a right-wing party called Ishin no Kai, which was allied with Komeito at the Osaka level, to change the administrative makeup of the region to basically create a metropolitan, a toll that is like Tokyo. And this was viewed rather cynically by the Gakkai membership for a number of reasons. And what my friends and other analysts confirm is that the inability of Komeito representatives to meet with Soka Gakkai people in person at Gakkai meetings in Gakkai facilities, to convince them to change their allegiances and to then drum up votes, their inability to do that meant that this referendum, they lost it. And so even though the head of Komeito went to Osaka, as is pictured here, with these masks that people now wear in Japan, keeping their breath in, they failed. And so what this also means is that we're seeing a diminishing number of Buddhist voices in Japanese government. And so this will have potentially a lingering impact. This is measurable. And I think it's a significant part of the story of what it means for Buddhism under the pandemic conditions. Let me round out with a different kind of story, and I think a heartening one, and it also calls back to the insights that Reverend Asahikawa introduced. There are these on-the-ground initiatives going on quietly in some cases and not receiving as much attention, frankly, as they should be in overall. And here's one example. of a social welfare initiative that's actually been going on for quite some time, precedes the pandemic, certainly. And this is an organization called Hitosaji no Kai, or Single Spoonful, or One Spoonful Association. It's a homeless aid outreach initiative on the part of a Jodoshu, or Pure Land sect temple, Eishoin. It's in Asakusa, and it's principally organized by Reverend Yoshimizu Gakugen. This is not a pseudonym because he's widely publicized, and he publicizes things under his own name. And so over the last decade plus, Reverend Yoshimizu, with many other volunteers who were within his own sect, other Buddhists, and sometimes people from other religions as well, and non-religious lay activists as well, have taken part in making food, delivering it to the many, many homeless people who live in this neighborhood. This is a very tough part of Tokyo, actually. This is the largest homeless population in Japan. It's historically a prostitution area, and it's quite gritty. It's quite tough, and it's also where a lot of homeless people from across the country end up living on the streets. And so what he noticed, what Reverend Yoshimizu noticed, was that after the onset of the pandemic, a new homeless population started appearing in the streets around his temple, and this was Vietnamese people who'd been displaced. There's been this program going on in recent years in Japan for nominally known as trainees, people coming from Vietnam, across Southeast Asia, but actually at this point, Vietnamese are the largest population of recent immigrants in Japan. Brought in nominally to train vocationally, but are actually used essentially as cheap labor to fill in the massive labor shortage that afflicts Japanese industries. And as things shut down, restaurants, other businesses started shutting down. A lot of the time, those businesses had the accommodation attached to them, and a lot of these folks from Vietnam ended up on the street. And so Reverend Yoshimizu, along with numerous other activists who were part of essentially a growing network across Japan, started seeing to the needs of this new population. I think it's significant that the majority of this population are fellow Mahayana Buddhists, and so there's already an opportunity here for ecumenical cooperation, which he fully took advantage of. And so there's this ongoing blog, which is linked in the links that are available in this presentation. He has on Facebook, and it's otherwise available, where he essentially is training his Japanese readership in Vietnamese Buddhism, and is telling them about these different traditions. As you can see in the photos here, the One Spoonful Association switched from making onigiri, which is the rice balls, traditional Japanese foodstuffs, to Vietnamese spring rolls to give out to this new homeless population. And has otherwise also mobilized a massive food gathering campaign. This is actually playing out this past December. 5 metric tons of rice gathered and then distributed across these different places where the homeless are staying largely in temples. They're also helping them with other pragmatic aspects. So the way I think about this is a means by which to think about moving beyond the triggers of inbuilt systemic racism, of bigotry, of fearing the internal other, and instead to reach across that divide and think about ways to move in a positive direction. I mean, there are some reading resources and viewing resources that you can also avail yourself of. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Professor McLaughlin, thank you so much for such a wonderful overview of what has been going on many different counts. And we'll, I'm sure, have questions for you and come back to you in a moment. But now I'd like to turn to Professor Jeff Wilson, Professor of Religious Studies and East Asian Studies at Renison University and affiliate institution of the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. He's the author of many books. I appreciated his first book, Mourning the Unborn Dead, a Buddhist ritual comes to America. It's about musical kuyo in America. It was followed by a book, Dixie Dharma, about inside a Buddhist temple in the American South. And in more recent times, he has 2 books, Mindful America, The Mutual Transformation of Buddhist Meditation in American Culture, and the selected works of D.T. Suzuki, Volume 3, Comparative Religion. And so just a very amazing scholar and also someone who is ordained in the as a minister in the Jodo Shinshu Buddhist tradition. And so Professor Wilson will be speaking. His presentation's title is "Spreading Only Compassion: North American Buddhist Institutional Responses to the Pandemic." Professor Wilson.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, great. I'm going to try to share my screen here. I hope this will work. And that will begin to show. Okay, all right. So thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you everybody for being here with us today. I'm honored to be coming to you from Waterloo, Ontario in Canada. And I wanted to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the Haldeman Tract, which is land promised to the Six Nations and comprising traditional territory of the Arawandran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. My presentation today is going to look broadly at how temple communities in Canada, the mainland United States, and in Hawaii have reacted to the pandemic. So I'm going to use this term temple in sort of a general way. So it's inclusive of meditation groups or Soka Gakkai chapters and other institutional forms. I should also note from the outset that English-speaking Buddhists in North America and Hawaii use the term Sangha to indicate whole Buddhist communities, including the lay members, unlike in some places where Sangha refers only to ordained monastics. So I just don't want anybody to get confused as I go through this material here. So let's get started. I'm not okay. This line comes from Reverend Blaine Higa's poem, I'm Not Okay, and That's Okay. I'm going to quote from this poem a lot in this presentation because his statements express the feelings of many American and Canadian Buddhists during the pandemic. The arrival of COVID-19 has profoundly changed Buddhist practice and communities, bringing fear, confusion, loneliness, illness, and death. I'm going to be noting 8 trends that typify the experience of Buddhist communities. Most of these were apparent within the first months of the pandemic, and they're going to probably continue to affect Buddhist practice for a long time. Some are likely to be permanent changes, and I think we'll definitely see some overlap with some of the phenomena that Levi noticed there in Japan. So Reverend Higa says, I'm not okay. I had to close the doors of the temple to protect my Sangha. And this typifies the first trend I want to point to, which is disruption of normal services. As COVID-19 spread across North America and Hawaii in the early spring of 2020, all Buddhist institutions experienced disruptions of their normal services and programming. And these lasted anywhere from weeks to months, or some of them are still ongoing. And some temples have been closed for this entire period. At certain points during the spring, all public on-site Buddhist activities in both Canada and the United States had come to a complete halt. And this included regular Sunday services, weekly meditation classes, funerals, public teachings, empowerments, you name it, just a stop of everything. For example, the Zen Center of Los Angeles, they initially closed for a few weeks, and then they eventually extended their closure through to the end of 2020. And now it's the second month of 2021, and they still have not reopened. So many other temples followed a similar pattern of initial closures and then extensions. Some closed, reopened, and then shut again. In the Toronto area here, the Toronto Buddhist Church closed in March. And among other things, this meant that we couldn't hold our usual midsummer obon graveside services with families that we're used to doing. This is actually one of the most important parts of the liturgical year for North American Buddhists of Japanese background. And so because of this big change in our usual procedures, we had to really think, what are we going to do about this? I don't think we've ever held a service with no attendees, but that ultimately is what happened. I ended up driving all by myself all over the region to conduct 19 services in empty cemeteries with no other participants, no family gathered there at the graveside. And this is probably unprecedented. Certainly, I've never heard of this sort of thing. It's not something that we've done previously at our temple. And because we couldn't have people gathered, it was not legal to have gatherings of any type. This meant that families who had lost loved ones recently, including people who had lost loved ones from COVID-19, they couldn't be present for that first memorial service, which is an important service in the Jodo Shinshu Buddhist tradition. Now, 7,400 kilometers away in Puna, Hawaii, Reverend Higa was facing the same sort of situation, right? In his poem, he wrote, "I'm not okay that I can't give a hug to someone grieving the loss of their loved one." And my second trend that I want to talk about is the massive increase in virtual Buddhist programming that happened. Since we couldn't give out hugs, we had to look for other ways to give remote comfort. And eventually temples began to figure out how to provide online services. Nearly every Buddhist group had some sort of, at least minimal, web presence before the pandemic, but really, in most cases, their internet usage was just designed to publicize or to maybe enhance a little bit their on-site offerings. There are very few that were equipped to actually offer religious practice via the internet. Not none, but the numbers were quite a small percentage. And then over the course of the spring and the summer, there was a progression that could be observed. At first, temples started with occasional Facebook posts, which provide some information and some support. And then they started to live stream services. Often these were conducted by solo ministers or teachers in empty temples or in their own homes. And then virtual workshops and retreats and meditation sessions began to appear. And finally, temples began to regularly produce technologically sophisticated videos that were specifically designed for remote consumption. It took a good while for this to sort of ramp up, but eventually most groups did get on board with that sort of thing. There was quite a significant learning curve involved there. The primary organizing principle at work with these sort of growing services was mostly replacement. Buddhist communities were seeking ways to do their usual activities, but to do them virtually rather than on site, with as few changes as necessary, especially in earlier stages. So an example could be found at the Midwest Buddhist Temple. With their building closed to the public, the Reverend Ron Miyamura began broadcasting Sunday services via Facebook. And his online service format was very, very similar to the pre-pandemic in-temple format. So he'd have opening words, he'd chant sutras, and he'd give a Dharma talk. And pretty much other than the lack of hymns, the only other major difference between a normal service and the online service he was providing was, of course, the absence of any lay congregation. Of course, as much as people wanted to try to replicate things, there were many changes that nonetheless were necessary. Since they weren't able to dance together, Japanese American Buddhist communities created virtual Obon celebrations, either using old video or new captures of themselves dancing in isolation. So there was a lot of like sort of TikTok Obon activity going on in midsummer. When the Houston Zen Center, they held an online meditation retreat. So then they concluded with the resident priest going around and bowing to photographs of the participants propped up against the zafus, the cushions, where they normally would have sat. So it was sort of like a on-site recreation of what was going on in everybody's solitude in front of their screens during this meditation retreat. Now, Reverend Higa said, "I'm not okay. Some selfish people are endangering the welfare of others by not staying at home." And anyone who followed the media or spent time outside, really, in 2020, knows that many people were not obeying the necessary precautions. But that certainly was not because of Buddhist obstructionism. The third trend that I want to note is the use of Buddhism to encourage proper safety measures. So there were some Buddhist communities that turned to their practices as buffers against the disease, but very, very few, if any, preached that Buddhist practice alone could halt the pandemic or prevent individual infection. Instead, Buddhist temples and Buddhist media became important sources of information dissemination about right hygiene and right distancing. For example, the Buddha's Light International Association chapter in Toronto, they organized a virtual information session, several of these actually for doctors, to educate temple members about COVID-19 and what was going on with the medicine and so on. The Won Buddhist Temple, Korean Buddhist temple in Philadelphia advised, quote, be a bodhisattva in your neighborhood. Find out what you can do to protect the elderly, the weak, and the suffering. Know that by just staying home in peaceful meditation, you are protecting them. End of that quote there. And Sensei Alex Kakuyo expressed a common sentiment on his blog called The Same Old Zen. He said, quote, we can find ways within our own sphere of influence to honor the Buddha and everyone we meet. One simple way to do this is by wearing a face mask when we go outdoors. Scientists say that doing so lowers our risk of spreading the virus, and in my own experience, it provides a feeling of safety to the people we meet, signaling that we care about their well-being. It's a small gesture, but this simple act is an effective way of bowing to the various Buddhas in our life. In this way, we transform the suffering of a pandemic into a pathway for our awakening. That ends the quote. And in these sort of statements here, shelter in place becomes bodhisattva activity, and medically necessary masks are transformed into Buddhist ritual items so that wearing one is a meritorious action of compassion. And many organizations that I observed drew upon the Eightfold Path to provide specific recommendations for hand washing, masking, and similar actions. And meditation and similar ritual activities were widely extolled by Buddhist groups for their mental health benefits, you know, during forced confinement and job loss and anxiety over health. So the Buddhist temples and groups were pretty much all of one voice in promoting proper behavior during the pandemic. This contrasts with some other religious groups in North America, some of which were in the media because of objections to having to close their worship spaces and having to obey certain laws. Buddhists actively promoted healthful practices, in my observation. Now, Reverend Higa says, I'm not okay because I feel like I'm not doing enough. And although he worried that he wasn't doing enough, and there were plenty of people who felt the same way, the fourth trend I want to point to is community service to fight the pandemic. There was quite a lot of it by Buddhists. So Buddhists didn't just share information about how to keep safe during the pandemic. Buddhist groups and Buddhist individuals rose to the challenge of the pandemic through innumerable charitable acts. So, for example, the Foguanshan Temple of Toronto donated masks and a ventilator and delivered vegetarian meals to frontline workers. And they raised over $25,000 towards personal protective equipment donations. And the nuns and lay people at the Diude Buddhist Temple in Pensacola, which we have here on the slide, they sewed thousands of masks in order to distribute these to the general public. And there were similar efforts that occurred on all scales, from individual Buddhists at their home sewing machines to quite significant international aid drives by transnational Buddhist organizations. And these sort of charity drives or individual actions, they help to channel the fear, the anxiety, the frustration, and frankly, the boredom of American and Canadian Buddhists into productive activities that provide a sense of power during the chaos of the pandemic. And largely physically separated from each other, these provided ways to work as a group and to regain a degree of community feeling. Now, in his poem, Reverend Higa says, "I am made okay by realizing the temple is not just a building, but a community of people who care for one another." And indeed, the temple as community responded by caring for one another, not just with direct medical aid, but also by focusing on how the pandemic could be understood and dealt with through Buddhist teachings. A nearly universal response across all Buddhist groups has been to use the pandemic as a way of illustrating Buddhist principles and encouraging Buddhist practice. So Buddhist leaders and commentators frequently use the ways in which our patterns and behaviors have changed during the pandemic to highlight the idea of impermanence. That's a pretty obvious one, right? And note how suffering results when we lose people or things or activities that we're attached to. And San Jose Soka Gakkai member Carol Assist implored others to chant as she reported about the experience of her and her husband's COVID-19 infection and how it strengthened her faith. I want to read a little bit from her report, which was published in a Soka Gakkai USA publication. She said, quote, "When the doctor told me that my husband had a 50-50 chance of survival, I started crying. I reached out to my district women's leader who told me, tears are sometimes needed, but this is not the time for tears. You need to sit down and chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo to the Gohonzon. Now is the time to have courage and fight. I did Gongyo. This is Nichiren practice, the Buddhist practice, Soka Gakkai practice. I did Gongyo and chanted every day, no matter how sick I felt. At times lying down because I couldn't sit upright, or whispering the words to get them out." So this is while she herself is infected with COVID-19 and her husband is so sick with COVID-19 that he's actually hospitalized. By the 10th day, Patrick's kidneys and liver were better, and he no longer had difficulty breathing, so he was able to come home. Though he was expected to take at least 6 months to recover, 2 months in, Patrick's doctor was surprised by an X-ray that showed his lungs were completely healed. And I'm sure Levi can well recognize this sort of testimonial narrative. It's one of the most common actual forms of discourse in Soka Gakkai. So she says, "This experience completely changed my practice. I now look forward to chanting in front of the Gohonzon every day and studying the SGI USA publications, which used to collect dust in the corner. These days, I share Buddhism with everyone I can, from my neighbors when I'm out walking my dog to my friends on Facebook. So many people are having a hard time, and I'm determined to encourage them all based on my great appreciation for my husband's life and the renewal of my own." So this was a very sort of dramatic in some ways and also stereotyped in other ways. Sort of testimonial that was delivered by this woman based on her real life experiences, her experiences and her husband's experiences with it. So they were made to practice Buddhism more because of their situation during the pandemic, and then they used this pandemic experience itself to then promote Buddhism to others. Now, Reverend Higa says, "I'm made okay by being part of the evolution of what it means to be Sangha." And as the months passed, temples realized that they were in the midst of unavoidable evolution, and they began to embrace the situation as best they could. For those that tentatively began to hold some public practice again, new procedures had to be worked out. Nearly every aspect of ritual and social gathering was altered in some way. For instance, at the Hokyoji in Minnesota, practitioners have to wear masks or face shields. They have to sit 6 feet apart in the zendo, and they have to run HEPA filters throughout meditation sessions, which are now limited to only 10 people on site at a time. We're actually in a state of emergency here in Ontario ourselves, but there was a period in early fall when provincial rules were temporarily relaxed somewhat. and local temples reopened, but with highly altered procedures. Practitioners entering the Chamshan Temple in Toronto, for example, they faced a gauntlet of whole new procedures. They were ordered to stay away if they felt sick, to wear masks and medical gloves. They had to park only in designated spots. And temple adherents first had to go to the Dizang Hall for disinfection. Then they had to go to the Puxian Hall for mandatory temperature checks before they could proceed into the practice area, where they still had to stand a couple of meters apart from each other. And then they had to leave right afterwards without the usual vegetarian meal and socializing that typically takes place in this community. At the Toronto Buddhist Church, we ourselves held a few Sunday services in the fall. Attendees had to register beforehand, they had to sign in, they had to provide information for contact tracing. I had to wear a mask while chanting and giving the Dharma talk. And we could only allow a handful of lay people to attend. They had to sit far apart from each other. And we gave out individual paper cups of incense rather than having everyone come and reach in together into the common incense bowl. And only myself and the other assistant minister were allowed to chant the sutras. Everybody else had to be silent. And we canceled the hymns entirely. And I have to say it was a very different sort of experience. So some ritual changes were small, but significant for other groups. For example, the Burmese Buddhist Society of British Columbia, they modified their traditional metta of Thanksgiving after receiving donations. So they now reply to donors, as you can see in the slide I provided here. They say, "May you and your family be free from pain and suffering. May you and your family be free from fear and anxiety. May you and your family be free from pandemic disease. May you and your family experience peace and joy." Now, Reverend Higa said, "I'm made okay by slowing down to realize what is most essential in life." And reassessing what was essential, many people during the pandemic have turned to family, to friends, and to their temples, to their religious communities. But those temples weren't just closed, they're also in deep financial peril due to the pandemic. Shuttering temples, this did cut down on some costs, such as utilities, but on the whole, expenses continue and ordinary revenue streams have been shut down. Fundraising, festivals, weekly donations, many other sources of income were impacted by the pandemic. And with buildings closed and services canceled, many of them floundered to find replacement funds. By August, already 51% of the temples in the Buddhist churches of America, the largest temple networks, they had applied for emergency pandemic loans from the federal government. Meanwhile, the San Francisco Zen Center, they projected a loss of $1 million for the initial months of the pandemic, and they scrambled to create an online fundraiser. Donors actually rose to the challenge in that case, and their drive was a success. But with massive job losses across North America, many people were unable to provide additional funding to their Buddhist communities. And some temples are surely going to permanently shut down in this situation. Direct appeals are pretty common to people to try to save their temples, but there's also been the evolution of more creative efforts to raise money. These are increasingly common. So for example, the Ekoji Buddhist Temple, which is near Washington, DC, they sold branded face masks and t-shirts with the slogan, "Spreading only compassion." The Oregon Buddhist Temple in Portland produced an entire online concert for fundraising. And in Edmonton, here in Canada, Alberta Gaiden Samtendeling, this is a Tibetan group, they held an online silent auction and an online bazaar where, among other things, they featured a training video showing people how to create momo, traditional Tibetan, I guess you call them dumplings. So here's my last slide. Reverend Higa says, "Not being okay makes me appreciate my full humanness, illuminated by the Buddha's light." The final trend I want to note is that this is not the first time Buddhist communities in America and Canada have faced crises. And as difficult as they may be, they are also moments of survival, solidarity, resistance, and innovation. Struggles are not only damaging to temple communities, they're also the raw materials from which communities are sometimes built and strengthened. This pandemic is the most widespread and disruptive single event that Buddhism in Canada and the United States has faced since World War II. And once again, these temples are being thrown into chaos. And from that chaos and the shared suffering, there's some clear signs of adaptation and response. There's much that's lost, but there's also some things that are gained in this situation. For example, at the Toronto Buddhist Church, we've moved to Zoom services. This is something we never even imagined before the pandemic. And frankly, it took us until about October to get to this sort of thing. And once some of the hiccups were worked out, there's been some unexpected benefits. Temple members in long-term care facilities or other situations where they couldn't attend on-site services in the past, they're now being included. And it's been wonderful to see some faces that have been absent from the temple for a long time. Also, new people have been joining the services. Some of these are people who said they would have been intimidated about coming to Buddhist services, especially if they're not from a Japanese Canadian background and they worry about fitting in or making mistakes. But the Zoom services, they let them basically lurk and get a feel for things and do this from the comfort of their own homes, right? So over time, some of them begin to participate more and they start asking questions. So digital services, they open up Buddhism to new audiences, even as they give regular members the chance to return in some fashion to support one another. Rushin Paul Haller at the Tassajara Zen Center in California put it this way. He said, 6 feet apart or closer than ever. And in the end, the challenge of maintaining Buddhism under difficult circumstances, it does incite organizing, creativity, and purpose in some cases. And thus, Reverend Higa says at the end of his poem, not being okay makes me strive to make things okay. I'm not okay, and that's okay. Namo Amida Butsu. So that's my presentation for everyone, and thank you very much.
Professor Wilson, thank you so much. Really appreciate that wonderful overview. Let me now come to our third and final speaker, Jun Hamamoto. She is somebody who I've known through just her amazing work in both racial justice as well as prison work. She has been working she's been teaching at the San Quentin prison since 2000. She received Jukai with her teacher, Seido Lee Dubaros, in 2008 at the San Quentin prison, where she attends the weekly Sangha. And she was further ordained in the Order of Interbeing by Thich Nhat Hanh in 2011. I've known her for her wonderful activism related to not only San Quentin, but also various ICE detention centers. She's been teaching origami to many people inside various kinds of detention facilities. And I wanted to ask her if she could share something from her experience and what is happening in recent times in the context of being in detained or confined situations. So if I could ask Jun if you could present to us.
Hi, I'm Jun Hamamoto. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling from Berkeley, California, which is Ohlone Native American land. I'm very happy to be here and want to express my gratitude to Duncan Ryuk Williams and to the USC Shinsho Ito Center. So I'm going to talk, just a brief outline. I'm going to talk about the beginning of the Sangha and what normal Sangha is like, which is very different from normal Sangha outside. So I'll talk about the first day of Sangha. I'll also talk about the unique challenges of having a Sangha in prison. And I'll talk about the last day that we met in person in Sangha. I'll talk about how we're keeping connected now, and a little bit about some other groups that I belong to, and how this is all also interconnected. And I'm going to make sure I check on the time here. I'm going to maybe shorten my talk a little bit. So the Sangha was started in 1999 by Sado Lee de Barros, and Sado was ordained a Soto Zen priest in 1989 at Green Gulch Farm Monastery by Sojun Mel Weitzman, and received his Dharma name, Dharma transmission, Sado Eshu, Clear Path Consultant, Constant Effort. And he received a Dharma transmission in 1998 from Zo Ketsu Norman Fisher. So before 1999, many prisoners wanted to have a Sangha at San Quentin and had tried for years. And Sado agreed to start the Sangha. And he served from 1999 to 2015 when he retired. And then he left us in 2019. So I want to read to you that very first day of Sangha at San Quentin. This is what he has to say. The first day, the room was full of people. Some of them were curious, what's new? When you're in prison, especially for a life sentence, anything new that comes down the pike, you kind of want to check out. And so a lot of people came. At first, I did everything, but now they do everything. They set up the zendo, they offer and help me offer incense. They constructed the necessary altars, they made cushions, and they created the whole environment at the Sangha. And I feel very strongly about this, is how I feel about Sangha also. And it's a little secret, but when other people are happy, you're happy too. If you're happy and other people are unhappy, that's a problematic situation. And if you think about it, and generally speaking, I think when you find a way to help someone, just out of your heart, it's the natural thing to do. Life is unfolded in a way where now you find you can help someone. Even in a small way, it makes you happy to be able to do that. What a blessing. And that's been my experience, over the 20 years at San Quentin. So that was the first day of Sangha. And the Sangha meets every Sunday night from 6 to 7:30, or did before COVID, with a sitting and then walking, keenan, and a break, a Dharma talk, and a question and answer in a closing circle. And then in 2015, we had a new sponsor. We share the zendo is actually a shared chapel. It's used by it's the Muslim chapel, the Jewish chapel, and it's the Buddhist chapel. So, but in 2015, we decided to apply to have a study group in addition to the normal service. So we added a 3 to 4:30 study group. And over the years, we've had 3. I wasn't there at the very beginning of Sangha, but over the years, we've had a Jukai service, ceremonies, which will be shown on this first slide that I have of Jukai at San Quentin. we've had, and there you can see the Sado in the middle, who's a priest, and Jiryu, who is now our priest, on the right, towards the right side in the front. And this is our congregation. We sewed our own, the men sewed their own wagesas. It was quite a bit of a struggle to be able to get approved in the sewing materials and the needles and scissors, but we managed to sew wagesas for everyone. So that was 2011. And then if you could show the next slide, it's 2018 Jukai. And there's 2 slides of that Jukai and some of our guests. And this last Jukai was very small, but very heartfelt. And the community of Sangha members from the inside is very diverse. It was interesting. It started out as a very white Sangha, and it's transitioned into being a very multiracial Sangha. So to kind of understand the change to ordinary, to COVID times, we were unable to bring food. We can't share food. We can't bring books in unless they're pre-approved, certain Buddhist books. And we're, so there are a lot of restrictions with being in prison. And I know that, like at our Buddhist Church of Oakland, food is a really big part of temple. We're allowed, all the religious groups are allowed to have one banquet religious meal a year. So we usually do it for Buddha's Enlightenment Day. And it's a huge deal in prison to be able to eat together and share food. So in the beginning, we used to cook, and we would make individual clamshells of food for everyone. And the men in the Sangha really enjoyed it. But then it changed to, no, it has to be all cooked in the kitchen. So I spent a number of banquet times in the San Quentin kitchen with some of the volunteer cooks from our Sangha, which was really an amazing experience. So we've had Jukai, we have a yearly banquet. We have a couple of times we can bring in tea and have tea meditation. Once a year we have cookies. So it's kind of very restricted. I remember one about 3 years ago, we did Thich Nhat Hanh's orange or tangerine meditation. And Brother Phap Sui came to do that meditation. And it was amazing to see how a simple orange could bring so much joy to people, which is true in normally doing this meditation outside, but in prison for men that haven't had a tangerine, sometimes in 25 years, it was a very, very special day. So we added the study group in 2015 from 3 to 4:30, and we would either study a sutra or a book, and that's been going on regularly. So there's kind of 2 groups that come in. We can go to either group. We've had many teachers. Our main teacher now is Jiryu Mark, which he's in the photo in the second row on the right. And Kanchin now is in the front row. She has got black and orange. She is now a priest in the lineage of Zen peacemakers. So those are our two teachers. And also Marianne is one of the people that organizes the group. So we've had teachers, Ralph Steele, Lama Rod Owens, Sister Jewel from Thich Nhat Hanh Order, Jack Cornfield, Noli Way Alexander, Tibetan lamas and nuns, and a few times monastics from Deer Park Monastery in San Diego, in the Thich Nhat Hanh order have come in to do group teachings. It's been was very rich and very meaningful to the men. I was just so touched by how deeply they connected, over a short evening together. So we have quarterly meetings at Green Gulch Farm Monastery, day long, with men who have paroled and are now outside Sangha members. A lot of the men have, been incarcerated for over 20 years. The highlight of these days at Green Gulch Farm has always been our walk through the farm to the beach. And it's wonderful to see people who haven't seen the beach in 20 years get a chance to see the ocean and the beach for the first time in so long. It's just amazing to see that kind of joy and happiness. So under normal conditions, not only for our Sangha and all the religious programs there at San Quentin and all the education and self-help programs, you never know when there's going to be an institutional recall, which is a guard will come running in and say, recall, and it will either be a specific housing unit or the whole prison. And the men have just a few minutes to gather up their stuff and go back. Sometimes it will actually be a lockdown. So it's kind of you go along doing your service and then suddenly interrupted and you're asked to leave. So that's kind of the everyday and what you kind of get used to. So there are a lot of unique challenges under normal conditions, having service and Sangha and study group. I want to mention just a couple things. I've worked with a lot of juvenile lifers who and a lot of immigrants who were bullied coming to this country and kind of ostracized and found their family, as a lot of men from prison and women in prison do, in gangs, and ending up spending 20 or so years in prison. But what's so beautiful about the San Quentin Soto Zen Sangha is to be able to watch over time people's transformation and change, and what peace and joy is brought into the lives of people who are part of this Sangha. So not very much time. Okay, so now during COVID, what has happened is we had our last service on March 15th. And we knew at that time that the prison was going into lockdown, the state was going into shelter in place. So we asked the men that they could join us and some of the people that from the outside Sangha that committed to being together while apart. So being together from the 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock time slot for the study group, that we would continue and we would hold them, and then being together from for this evening service from 6. We have it shorter now, from 6 to 7. So we that's what we do. We are together while apart. And in addition, we have packets, which we send in. It's kind of like a monthly correspondence course. In this recent packet, we're studying actually chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra and reading Thich Nhat Hanh's commentary on the Lotus Sutra, and Jiryu Mark, our teacher's, his commentary. I also added in that packet Thich Nhat Hanh's poem, Please Call Me by My True Names, and Thich Nhat Hanh's a beautiful, heartfelt commentary on that. And also I put a little note in there. It's a very touching poem about how we all have the seeds of joy and happiness, and we all have the seeds of an ability to be violent and harmful depending on what seeds are watered within us. So I don't have much time here, so I'm going to say that with the monthly packets, we're now also sending to death row, which we hadn't before. Someone else had been ministering, doing the Buddhist ministry at death row, but she has Susan. She is a wonderful teacher in the Tibetan lineage. She sends a part of the packet in usually every month. So now we're sending packets into death row, which feels very different, but in another way, not different. So I think what is just really unique is that we would love to be able to have a Zoom session with our Sangha inside San Quentin. And what we do have is the ability to have a correspondence type course. So, we do the best we can. In the packet on the Lotus Sutra, chapter 25, we're going to continue to practice together, but alone, and try to really sink into what practicing together means. I'm wondering if I could ask Duncan if I should stop here, because we're really out of time, and wondering what you think.
I'm very happy to extend our time a little bit, and I'm sure most people on this call would be happy to do so. So please, if you have a few more things you'd like to share, I think we're all very much appreciating it.
Okay. I'll go on for a little bit longer. Let's see. So so COVID came to San Quentin. We had a very touching last Sangha study session and service, and we told the men that Sangha would be canceled until further notice, thinking that it would be similar to when Legionnaires affected San Quentin, and we were there was no programming for several months. But we had no idea that it was going to go on this long. I'm so happy that some of us were able to come in that last day and share that we're going to continue our practice with the men. And so now we have the following, so that was March 15th. March 22nd, we started a Zoom Sangha for the folks outside, which are the volunteers that go in, and any of the members of our Sangha formerly incarcerated that would like to join. So we do that every Sunday, and it's been lovely to be able to connect with those people that are out. There are more people that are getting out now than that were before in the last 2 or 3 years since SB 260 and 261 passed about life sentences for men, women who committed their crimes as children. So we have a wonderful Sunday night Zoom call for 1 hour. And then one of the lovely parts of that is reading out the names of all of our Sangha brothers that are inside incarcerated, to know that we are thinking about them. So the packets are, we're not writing back individually to the responses that we're getting from the packets. It was decided by the group that we didn't have the capacity to do that. And anyone that writes that seems like they would like to have a Sangha pen pal, those letters are sent to the San Francisco Zen Center pen pal program. So that's how that's addressed. But in the next month's packet, general questions will be addressed if they can be addressed to the whole membership. Let's see. There's a bunch more stuff I would like to share about Okay, but I will say that a number of my students, well, a number of the Sangha members, and then particularly I teach an origami class through, it's called William James Arts and Corrections, that teaches art classes in prison. And so we do origami. I do origami with the Buddhist group also. I've been doing it for a number of years. With the World Tree of Hope, we did do the tree in San Francisco. We've done folding for Tsuru for Solidarity in protest of ICE detention camps, supporting the closure of ICE detention camps. So there's a number of social justice causes that we fold origami for, and the Sangha folds origami for. And we sent cranes to Crystal City, Texas, to the pilgrimage there. That was an ICE detention camp during World War II. And we continue with different campaigns. We folded for Cal State East Bay. Our friend Diane Woods teaches a sociology class there. We folded for an altar called Healing the Trauma of Racism, dedicated to the Black people who lost their lives to police violence. So we got just a lovely, heartfelt response from the men who wanted to fold for that altar. So,
June, maybe that's a good segue to
okay.
our kind of a group conversation.
Yes.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And thank you. And so, you know, I was just maybe on that last note about social or racial justice during pandemic times. I was, Professor McLaughlin, I think you mentioned some really interesting examples of this kind of Buddhist response to some of the COVID-19 anti-Chinese kind of like sentiment that we know much more about, I think, here in the United States, but you mentioned the Shingon Buddhist priest speaking out about that, and also that, what was it, Vietnamese rolls instead of the onigiri, to talk about the economic displacement that's happened during the pandemic, and the role of Buddhists in advocacy work like that. Jeff, I wonder if you have any kind of examples of that type of where, you know, I feel like these days we talk a lot about the pandemic, both in terms of the kind of economic impact, the kind of distancing and the kind of social isolation aspect of things, but also how we've seen these disparities around race in terms of COVID impact. And of course, in the United States in particular, you know, things that have to do with police and prisons and so on. Do you have any examples from Canada or anywhere else in your research that would speak to that kind of intersection of how the kind of pandemic era and kind of like who belongs, I guess, is one of the kind of questions that's on people's minds about equity and racial justice?
Oh, well, thank you for the question there, Duncan. So certainly here in Canada also, we've had many of our own troubles. There's been a spike in anti-Asian Canadian racism, absolutely, because of sort of racist associations of the virus with China and so on. We saw a lot of that in the United States as well. We're hardly immune to it here in Canada. So there has been a lot of attention to that. However, since our panel is sort of formed around the idea of Buddhists reacting to these things specifically, I have to say that I haven't seen much in the way of organized Buddhist response to it. Individually, the Buddhist Twitter sphere and so on was very active in decrying these sort of things and pointing out cases and retweeting and so on, and getting, sort of mobilizing in informal ways, but Buddhist institutions were not strongly related in terms of the pandemic. Now, in terms of things like Black Lives Matter and so on, there was a significant response in North American and Hawaiian temples, but I can't, in my mind, directly connect that to the pandemic. Rather, it all happened in 2020 and the pandemic happened in 2020 as well. But many people actually had to choose, do we go out into the streets and try to march and perform a direct activism? Is that a safe activity, or is it preferable to stay at home and not infect people, especially because it's by far minority populations, especially Black and Latinx communities that have been so devastated by this disease in North America. So do you go out amongst people and maybe spread the infection, or do you stay at home and not respond as effectively to police violence and other things? These were strong debates that people had on sort of the in their networks and so on. I think that if we'd had a normal year without the pandemic, there would have been a lot more organizing at temples and this sort of thing. But it was scattered in my observation. Sorry that I don't have any really good anecdotes there.
No. Well, thank you. And then, I think you had this phrase, what is gained, what is lost when things move to that kind of online sphere. And then First McLaughlin, I wanted to kind of go back to you. I know you had intimated also, I feel like you also personally are involved with like musical spheres more than most of us. And you had talked a little bit about this word exsanguated, or kind of something about losing the lifeblood or something of things when things are unable to, I guess, I think we learned very early on, like the difficulties of like multiple people on Zoom being chanting and like each other's voices canceling each other out and whatnot. And so anyway, I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the kind of, Jun Hamamoto kind of referred to this as, being together while apart, or kind of together but alone. Like, what have you heard from Japan about some of those type of like more embodied kind of in-person gathering? That what is it that's lost from that kind of ceremonial or ritual dimension?
I can give you an example. So one of the most enriching aspects of my engagement with practitioners over the last 2 decades has been playing violin with Soka Gakkai orchestras and ensembles. And so one of the groups that I've been fortunate enough to take part in, the chamber orchestra, contacted me in 2020 and said, hey, you're going to be taking part in our performance, but it's going to be online, and it's going to be with this basically recorded separately. We're going to put it together. So I got a YouTube video of the conductor in front of a socially distanced string quartet, everyone wearing masks, playing, and then I had to have the ear plug in, record myself on this mic, which it turns out is not great for the violin, which just blasts the heck out of this thing. And then agonizingly record myself doing this stuff. And then our conductor had the unfortunate task of putting it all together into this collated performance of a transcription of a Soka Gakkai song. And it very much, almost word for word, actually delivered in the together, but separate but together sentiment was layered atop that video performance. It did a lot of things. I guess the word that comes to mind is it was a wistful experience. It just reminded us of what we lose by not being able to play together. And but it also perpetuates the community that we forged through those many hours of being with one another in all kinds of situations. And so a few things came to mind in that regard. One is that it seems very difficult to initiate new connections under these circumstances. It's meaningful to recall, to reflect upon all that you've gained up to this point, and it is meaningful to perpetuate it through these arduous means. But you have to wonder how, as these conditions become seemingly eternal, what it's going to mean in the long term. And as I mentioned, like the musicality, not just of playing music directly, but of practice. And this really, I mean, as June was speaking, I just kept thinking of how much more agonizing it must be when you're in prison, and what you lose at that point seems so far more severe than for those of us who are not incarcerated.
And so maybe I could go back to June about this. You know, you gave that wonderful example of a simple orange, being able to taste it and have that meditation on a tangerine. I feel like it is sometimes, you know, that small thing. It's not anything 100% dramatic. It's these kind of small things about a new way of seeing, feeling, a perspective shift that can happen that sometimes helps people in difficult or adverse situations, such as being in a prison for life or for a very long period of time. I wonder if you, in this kind of COVID period, have heard anything, you know, how should we say, because of that needing to be even further apart. I think, you know, in the Soto tradition, there's that Suzuki Hoitsu, you know, son of Reverend Suzuki Shunryu of San Francisco Zen Center. He had this definition of Sangha, or description of Sangha, where he said, it's like when you put a bunch of potatoes in a cold, you know, bucket of water, and you start rubbing them up against each other to clean the, you know, the little things that are on the ends of potatoes. That's Sangha, like being able to kind of rub up against each other and act as kind of mirrors to each other. And I wonder if you have any correspondence or any kind of intimations from the men during this lockdown period, the severe kind of lockdown period in San Quentin, where the correspondence course seems to be the only way to do it. If they've had any kind of these small glimpses or small ways in which Buddhism has been helpful.
There have been a number of letters of men that have written that the practice keeps them going, and that they meditate every day. That the incarcerated people in the Sangha have a very, very strong practice. I wasn't a very good meditator when I first went in. I just saw how strong and deep their practice is. So we've had a number of responses of how the meditation has really made all the difference for them to cope and survive. So yes, very powerful. I've also gotten some amazing letters from my origami students, because I usually put a Buddhist lesson in with my origami, you know, and I tell them they don't have to read it if they don't want to. But we also think of origami as a meditative spiritual practice. And a number of students, like the majority of my students, have said how origami has kept them sane. They're maybe locked in their cell 23 hours a day. And then I send in packets of paper, instructions, and a note that I do every 2 weeks. But it gives them something to do, and I send in blank cards so they can write to their loved ones and family, and that kind of keeps them connected to the outside world. I think writing is kind of somewhat of a lost art these days, but in prisons, people write. It's very, because they don't have any internet connection. For a long time during the pandemic, they didn't have access to the telephones that they have to wait in line for a long time. So they only have the TV in their cell that they have to buy themselves. And they were for a while getting a shower 2 to 3 times a week, and they have to wait in line for the shower. After it opened up a little bit, they got to go to the yard, but only one tier a day, and into different yards. So they'd be on the yard for 1 to 2 hours once a week, then sometimes twice a week. The whole kitchen shut down at some point. They were getting a bologna sandwich and some cubes of cheese not really enough calories to sustain. So it was just really harsh circumstances. 2,500 men tested positive, and out of a population of 4,000, and 28 people died. A number of students that are out now, told me how they were sick and they knew they had COVID, but they didn't want to go get tested because they ended up going what used to be the hole. So a couple of my students wrote, my origami students wrote to say, I tested positive and now I'm in the hole. They don't have an electrical outlet in there. They're a single person, no electrical outlet. The toilet's backed up. They had to use the bathroom in a plastic bag. And one student wrote, I'm like so sick with COVID and I had to clean the feces off my wall. And it was just horrific conditions. So there are these like little sparks. It's just amazing of joy and happiness that happen through the Dharma, through the teachings, through folding origami. It's just remarkable to me, the resilience and heart.
Thank you for sharing that, June. One of the things that I think in this period we often hear as framing kind of things is like, this is something X is unprecedented, right? So I feel like there's some things that, is it the kind of fake news, what nobody believes in, like is it the internet and Zoom thing? Like, I think both Living and Jeff, you mentioned the idea of like some things are going to temporarily shift because of this circumstance, and other things might have more kind of enduring changes to the way sanghas operate. And I wonder if you could reflect both kind of thinking forward as well as potentially thinking backwards because of that idea of unprecedented. I think what Jun just was mentioning is that human beings have been in very difficult, adverse situations before, right? And found different ways to manage and try. I think Jim called it like doing the best we can, right? But I wonder if you could reflect a little, any of you, on this idea of like, what is unprecedented and what is an enduring fact of just being in human life and society that this past year has taught us, and what will that mean for things moving forward? If anybody has any thoughts on that. And by the way, if anybody has any questions who are participating as kind of audience today, I'm happy to share your questions if you put in the chat or the Q&A with the speakers. And but I wanted to invite any of you to comment on this question about like what seems like a temporary shift and more enduring shifts, and is that because the problem is temporary or the problem is an enduring one, and what are we doing? I would love to hear your thoughts.
I can jump in quickly. In a Japanese Buddhist context, one of the intriguing aspects of the temple system is that actually much of what is in place is secured as the tradition of Japanese Buddhism is a product of response to epidemic. And so, for example, the Kokubunji system is the series of monasteries and nunneries that were supported by the government from the 730s onwards, centered at Toldaiji, the great temple, massive temple in Nara, initially were created as a network in response to what was probably a smallpox epidemic that spread through the Japanese archipelago at that point. Killed about a third of the population, including many powerful courtiers. And so it was seen as the responsibility of the ritualists of the country to respond, to protect Japan. And I think that legacy is very much in place, and you see it revived now in the course of 2020. And then there's to respond to your question, Duncan, is this unprecedented? And in a funny way, no. In fact, this is built, it's sort of woven into the DNA of Buddhist practice, is one of the routine responsibilities of those who teach Buddhism, who carry out practices, who retain the legacies and the memories is to respond to calamities precisely of this nature. There are aspects, though, in terms of the practical response. And so the most immediate experience for most aid providers who are coming from the Buddhist world is 311. And so many people in 2011 took part in what was then the largest mobilization by Buddhist practitioners since the Pacific War. And it relied upon intensive social interaction. It relied upon on-the-ground operations. So now they are facing what, for them at least, is an unprecedented situation. How do you mobilize people when you're supposed to be locked down? How do you serve the needs not of a specific disaster area, but of an entire country? All kinds of things that are requiring massive readjustments, and in fact have left many of those veterans of the 311 response somewhat at a loss in some cases. And so, for example, one of the legacies of that is the interfaith chaplaincy efforts that are now located in Northeast Japan. They're called Rinsho Shukyoshi in Japanese. The people who basically created ecumenical forms of training to operate in clinical settings, to be part of teams in hospice care, not in prisons. That has its own ministries in already set up in Japan, but in places where there ordinarily weren't so many Buddhist practitioners available in hospitals and things like that. Now they can't go in, and they haven't yet received enough official recognition to ensure they have a place in the COVID situation. So a lot of stuff is up in the air, and it's very much undecided.
So
Jeff,
maybe,
yeah.
yeah, sure. I'll try to speak to that question as well. It's so interesting to hear, from Levi about these examples of how essentially a Buddhist society has responded over the ages, really, to the threat or actuality of large-scale pandemics or epidemics. The situation is so different in North America and Hawaii for Buddhists, where we're talking about a non-Buddhist society, and where Buddhism is regionally relatively strong in a few places, such as California or Hawaii, but for the vast majority of people in Canada and the United States, Buddhism is a very small group. Even if they are Buddhists themselves, they're amongst their own community, but they're always minorities amongst a much larger population. So there don't tend to be social level responses by Buddhists, but rather the Buddhists have to respond to what the society around them is doing. I did want to say something quickly, though. I did think a little bit further about Duncan's earlier question about social justice stuff in 2020 and in any connections to the pandemic. Like I said, there weren't a lot of strong connections and right away, but something that I might point to is that, and this speaks to something about some of the changes we talked about, there is such a shift that is occurring of moving people into, for better or for worse, a new sort of technologically mediated media environment, where the media is the primary way of interacting with each other rather than interacting with people face to face. And so this is having many deleterious effects on communities, but it's also creating new forms of virtual communities or dispersed communities, so that previously, if you lived, say, in Eastern Canada, such as myself, you've actually spent really your whole day never interacting with other Buddhists except, like your own family, this sort of thing, right? And then maybe on Sunday, you would go to the temple and, for a few hours interact with some other Buddhists. So then you went back to non-Buddhist society and so on. Well, we all had phones and we had computers, and so you could go on the internet and have some interaction with some Buddhist somewhere, but it was the small potato sort of stuff. Now we're living our lives online. If we are privileged enough to be able to have easy internet access, and so what you're finding, I think, over time is that webs are developing whereby people are spending a lot of time actually with people in other geographical locations that they never would have interacted with, or at least never to this sort of constancy previously. And so that is reshaping things, and there'll be many effects that are hard to accurately predict. But one thing I can note is that, for example, Upaya, major Zen monastery in New Mexico, run by Joan Halifax, they've just started a year-long socially engaged Buddhist training program. And this has never been done before. There's never been some sort of major online socially engaged Buddhist training program tried by any group in the United States or in Canada. And they have 300 people signed up for this. So in fact, they've had to turn people away because they're full. It's an enormous outpouring of people. I can promise you, if you had run it 2 years ago, you could not have filled 300 people to fill this sort of thing. But now people are so used to living their lives online and so used to connecting. And frankly, they don't have time for anything else. I mean, this is the only thing that they have time for this, right? Previously, people would have been too busy doing other things and living their lives. They would not have signed up for a year of, online engaged Buddhist training. But now it's like, okay, they have the availability. They now have the relative tech savviness. Looking at the people who were engaged in it the other night in their first session, I could see most people were of an older age who probably, on the whole, were not spending significant amounts of time online in online Buddhist activities previously. So this is definitely one of the effects is the shifting from on-site into virtual communities. And then so all those hundreds of people forming around those concerns, they're connecting with each other through this class. And you can be sure that there's going to be a wave of then dispersed, but also in many local places, actions that come out of this sort of thing. So that's going to be quite interesting to track. I think this forming of much stronger geographically dispersed interconnecting Buddhist webs, this is probably going to be a permanent thing from now on. I don't want to talk too much, but I do notice that also amongst young Asian American, primarily Japanese American Buddhists in the United States have been very involved in creating Young Buddhist Editorial, which is a new group started just before the pandemic hit, but I believe the pandemic caused people to spend a lot more time with each other online. So it's developed quite a strong web on its own there.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I just realized we have gone quite a bit over time, and we're about to hit at least on the West Coast 6 o'clock hour. And for Jeff and to those who are out on the other side of other time zones, it's getting quite late. And so I really want to thank Jun Hamamoto, Jeff Wilson, Levi McLaughlin for their wonderful presentations. We could, I'm sure, go on for quite some time to talk about these ever evolving, still undergoing and evolving realities of Sangha in pandemic times. But thank you all three presenters for your presentation. I thank all the participants for coming in today. And with that, let's close our session this evening.